A little over 6 hours south of this very location, in a little town called Uvalde, Texas, 21 people were shot and killed in a mass school shooting. Now, we can say a lot about what happened that day, but my point is this. Before anyone opened up a single article on the incident, we automatically knew three things. Just statistically, we knew three things. Number one, that the shooter was young. Number two, that the shooter was mentally unwell. And number three, that the shooter was a man. Statistically, we knew that most likely it was a young man who was unwell. Now, what that young man did was vile and evil and wicked, and it is hard for our minds to wrap around what actually transpired. But what that young man was dealing with, mentally, relationally, internally, months and years before he actually walked into that school, well, that shouldn't be hard for us to wrap our minds around. You see, young men today are not okay. And the young men who hurt us are oftentimes young men who are hurting. And it should be no surprise. When a young man grows up in a culture that tells him we don't want you and we don't need you, that puts our young men in a crisis. And this crisis has been going on for some time now. In the 53 largest developing nations in the world, boys fall behind girls in almost every academic subject, especially reading and writing. Boys are far more likely to drop out of both high school and college, and in a few years, girls will graduate college at twice the rate that boys will. Boys and men across all regions and all ethnic groups have been failing both absolutely and relatively for years. Yet this global young man crisis is almost entirely ignored by schools and legislatures and media. Young men, like the Uvalde shooter, are without community, leadership, or safety of trusted adults. They lack churches, family connections, friendships, and mentors. Young men just are not forming social bonds with real, living people anymore. New York University marketing professor Scott Galloway said it this way: the most unstable nations in the world have one thing in common. They have too many lonely and broken men. And when a nation is full of lonely and broken men, it directly corresponds with the crisis we see for young men socially. Andrew Yang, in a recent article, noted that roughly 1/3 of men are either unemployed or out of work. And there are more U.S. men from the ages of 18 to 34 who are living with their parents rather than a significant other. We live in a young man crisis. Now, when the culture sees something like Uvalde, they scream, well, it must be toxic masculinity. That's got to be the problem. That's why he did what he did. To which I would reply, really? Well, let's look at the numbers. 48% of boys are raised by single mothers. 78% of school teachers are female, which means a large portion of the young men in this country are exclusively being raised by women. Maybe toxic masculinity is not the problem. Maybe a total lack of real masculinity in a young man's life is. So, as we face this young man crisis in our culture and in our world, what's the answer? What's the answer? Well, gentlemen, that's where you come in. That's where I come in. That's where every man sitting in this auditorium tonight comes in. The answer is you. The answer is me. The answer is that you and me start displaying what real masculinity actually looks like. And so that begs the question, where do we find the best picture of true masculinity? Well, you know the answer. It's on the tip of your tongue. And his name is Jesus. Jesus came as a man, and he has shown us what true masculinity is and what isn't. It is a life marked by sacrifice. True masculinity is a life marked by sacrifice. Jesus' life exemplifies what it means to be masculine and to live and die for something bigger than ourselves. He was a man who lived both on purpose and with purpose. And if we're going to be the men that we have been called and created to be, that's my thesis for you. That we become men who both live on purpose and men who live with purpose. And there's a difference. And I want to flush that out this afternoon. So first, we become men who live on purpose. George Orwell wrote that a man with no means of filling up his time is as miserable out of work as a dog is on a chain. Here's a simple truth. Men need to be needed. We imagine ourselves as builders, soldiers, workers, brothers, part of something bigger than ourselves. And we deal with idleness terribly. Young men deal with idleness terribly. So if we don't practice intentional living on purpose, we tend to fall in one of two categories. Either we become self-seeking, self-serving, aggressive, angry, embittered men who become abusive and or even violent, much like the young men. Using what God has given us as men, things like strength and power for evil, and we can end up there if we do not live on purpose. Or we end up where many of us end up, and that is as passive observers. Passive observers. Sitting, waiting, stuck in our addictions and our pastimes, sitting on our hands, waiting to be called in by a culture that is never going to call us in. Remember, they don't want us, and they think they don't need us. Or as one author put it, young men are in an unconscious protest. We don't even know it. We don't even realize we're sitting and waiting and sitting and waiting and sitting and waiting. And so if we do not commit ourselves to intentional living, we will fall into one category of aggression and abuse, or the other category, passivity. We must commit ourselves and force ourselves out of the slump we so often find ourselves in. We must both reject the flesh and the culture that tells us that what makes us a man is wrong with us, when the exact opposite is true. What makes us a man is what's right with us. We must become men who use our wills, our drives, our strengths, our ambitions, our time, our resources, and our very lives on purpose. Because there is too much at stake if we don't. But let's face it, we can decide to live on purpose, but to what end? You can use your time and your life and your resources purposefully for you. And there are many men out there who are doing that. They're living on purpose for themselves, which is my second point. We can't just live on purpose. We have to live with purpose. Or you might say live with a higher purpose. It is not just that we must live our lives on purpose. It's that there has to be a deeper driving force behind that kind of living. And fortunately, we don't have to dig to come up with that or carve it out somewhere for ourselves. God has made us men, He has built into us what makes us men, and he has given us the very calling and purpose that our hearts so desperately long for. And we read it in places like Matthew 16:24-26. Then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul?" So let's put some practical application to this, man. What does it look like to take up your cross in a world of lonely and broken men? Well, I think it looks like mentorship. I think it looks like mentorship. How might that story have gone different in Uvalde if that young man had another man speaking truth into his life? Because a mentor might send a text at the right time. He might show up at the front door the morning a bad choice is being forthcoming. His voice might ring in the ears, in the background, at a life-changing moment. His very presence might reinforce a weakening safety net just enough to make a young man feel safe. So number one, on purpose, your job is to go out and find that kind of mentorship, because your very life depends on it. You must find mentorship if you are going to stay the course. And I realize that maybe some of you don't have fathers who are that for you or have been that for you. And for that, I am very sorry. But you have a heavenly Father who loves you and cares for you in a way that no earthly father ever could. And once you have been the receiver of that kind of mentorship, and the kind of mentorship you've even received these last 9 weeks, the point is not to hoard it. The point is not to keep it. The point is to give it away. The point is to give it away. And so on purpose, you go out and you find mentorship. And then with purpose, when you get a chance, later on in life, you turn around and you give it to the men coming in behind you. You give that kind of mentorship, friendship, and community to the young men who are coming in behind you, because their very lives depend on it. Men who live life on purpose, and men who live life with purpose. Now, how do we know that men whose lives are marked with self-sacrificing purpose make all the difference in the world? We know because on that day, in that school in Uvalde, when that young man walked into that school without purpose, it was a man with a self-sacrificing purpose who stopped him. A man willing to use what made him a man for the good of others. A man who was willing to put his life on the line to save others. Gentlemen, the world needs you. They don't know it, but they need you. They don't want it, but they need you. They need your strength. They need your leadership. They need your work ethic. They need your energy. They need your tenacity. They need your resilience. They need your self-sacrificing purpose. The very things that make us men. So my challenge to you is to take up your cross, live life on purpose, with purpose, and follow him. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the reality of the gospel. We thank you that Christ has come and has given us an example of what it is to be a man, what it is to walk in a manner worthy of our calling, and that we would be such men. Father, thank you for the Spirit that lives in us so that we can be such men. Father, help us to know you. Help us to seek out mentors who will help us know you. And then when we have the opportunity, we would turn around and mentor those behind us who our very lives depend on. Father, we love you. Thank you. Your will would be done in these men's lives. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.